Welcome back, Paula. It's great that we're able to spend a bit more time with you today. And for those people on the conference, they'll also notice two familiar faces, I think, with Elaine and Claude, who are also with us this afternoon. Elaine's the minister at Morden Baptist Church, and Claude is the minister at I guess three Baptist churches at the moment, Claude, or three churches, Seven Kings and IPC, and also Aldersbrook, although Aldersbrook and IPC are at the moment in the process of merging. So, but that's where Claude's at as well. This session is entitled In Conversation with Paula. And as Paula and I were talking about this session, we felt rather than it just being me and her, it would be better if we included some other folks. And so that's why Elaine and Claude are joining with us. So this is going to look a little bit like this, I hope. I'm going to ask Paula some questions. She's going to respond, and Elaine and Claude also, I hope, will respond to her and perhaps ask some further questions, make some comments, and we'll see where we get to in the next half an hour or so. So let's crack on, shall we? Paula, you spoke this morning about your thoughts on Paul and lockdown, and I think it would be really helpful to kind of reflect on our experiences in light of some of the things that you spoke about earlier. So I guess my first question to you would be this. How do you think the church is changing as a result of the pandemic? And what might we learn from those earliest Pauline communities that could inspire us for the future? So how is the church changing, and how might we learn and be inspired from those things?
I think my initial response, and I'll be fascinated to hear what Elaine and Claude say, is that what lockdown has made us do is be flexible. I was really struck in a conversation with a colleague of mine who used to be the Church of England's diocesan communications person, the whole Church of England was one. And he was saying that when he was in his role, he's now in a parish, he spent such a lot of energy trying to get churches to do online services. And he simply could not persuade anyone to be interested. They said, we're just too full on being on the ground, doing what we're doing, simply can't do it. I think in the course of his time, he persuaded about 5 churches to be interested in it. Whereas now we've all suddenly brushed up our technical skills and learned how to do online worship. And I think for me that one of the really interesting things is that we struggle in churches to change, don't we? We really, really struggle to do new things. And what lockdown has done is said, go on, do a massive new thing overnight, learn how to do it. And on one level, that's been really hard work. And I'm married to someone who is ordained in the Church of England. And I know I've seen him learn all his skills and do really, really hard stuff. And can I also say to all of you who've done that, such great admiration, really, really genuine, huge admiration for everything that you've learned to do over the course of lockdown. Absolutely amazing. So we've learned how to do a whole load of new things. And we've also learned that our instincts that say that's not really church have had to be challenged, because now we're recognizing that it is really church. So the first thing that I think that I would just like to reflect on is how lockdown forces us into doing new things and how that is challenging for us, but also kind of takes us into a whole new area. And where I've been reflecting a lot around Paul is that there are ways in which Paul did online churches. His letters are effectively an online communication because he is not there. He's sending something out to people that he knows really well, but he's not in the same context as them. And they've had to learn actually what it means to relate to someone over a distance rather than actually there in a room. So I think there's something there about change and about challenge. And I think when all of this is over, who knows when it is going to be over, but when all of this is over, actually there'll be a whole load of things we'll look back and say, thank God for what God taught us in this context. Thank God for everything that we needed out of that. And I don't know what Elaine and Claude feel in response to that, but that's kind of certainly where my thinking's going.
I love what you're saying about being flexible. And I think for me in my church context, that's actually been one of the real challenges. Being a larger church, having a building that actually can't accommodate more than 12 households if we're doing it properly in a physical way. And so that flexibility, I think what I've seen is that smaller churches have been able to embrace that flexibility a lot easier, a lot more easily. And so I wonder if there's something from even Paul's perspective of actually he had those new churches, those smaller churches, those churches that were scattered in different locations. And how we can learn from that. You know, there's something about making things smaller is making them so much more adaptable and flexible. So yeah, well, I've been wondering about that.
Well, do you know that I think it's a really interesting point, because scholarship now on the Pauline communities think that it's highly likely that most of the communities were really small, and that what they would do from time to time is gather together in a bigger place. So there's various work done on what those earliest communities look like, and they reckon that people would gather in people's tenement buildings, their apartments, or in workshops, or but much smaller places than originally we thought. To begin with, people thought that they lived in they met in those kind of lovely big Roman houses, those with a nice atrium and a big dining room and all of those things, the posh houses, the stately homes, and all the evidence now indicates that actually that's not the case, that they did actually meet in people's small houses. So therefore they were small adaptable communities, and then from time to time when a big thing happened, like Paul sent a letter, they would all get together in someone's big house, but mostly that wasn't the case. So I think there's something in that really worth thinking about, and what that teaches us in terms of how we have our patterns of gathering now.
Claude, you're on mute, so it'd be good if you do unmute yourself, but it would be interesting to hear your perspective on this, because I know that you're doing something really quite deliberately online now.
Yes, I always reflect on Paul's letter to the Philippians, and as we have all become very familiar with Philippians 4:13, that's where he said that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, there is a very, very collective response to the effect of the pandemic, which has been quite debilitating and troubling to most churches. And it comes to a point where you definitely have to go along as a church and make the best out of the situation. Now, my concern or my question is the marginalized, those who probably are not able to tap into the effectiveness of the technologies that we are using at present, and how we have almost had to exclude them. Because Lee said that my church is doing something deliberately online, but then I still struggle with the aspect of not being able to involve everybody, especially those who are not very much abreast with modern technologies. So I don't know, from a Pauline perspective, what probably have you got to say about inclusivity in that regard?
I think you make a really, really important point, Claude. And actually, it's something that Paul would have cared about hugely all the way through his letters. But I would say, especially in 1 Corinthians, you have this strand of making sure that you notice who is excluded by the things that you're doing, and making sure that they're drawn into it. I think there's something very important in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 about inclusion and the importance of inclusion. So I'm just wondering whether actually Paul would say letter writing. Letter writing excludes no one other than people who actually can't read your handwriting, which could be problematic in my case. But I think there may be something in actually us constantly, and I think you're right to press us, constantly asking that question: who have we excluded by the way in which we're doing our worship today? You know, and for me, one of the really striking things is hearing the voices of people who haven't been able to get to church physically for years for access reasons, saying to us, actually, welcome to our club. You know, we've been doing this for years. So now we've kind of shifted in a certain way that includes certain people, but as you absolutely rightly say, it therefore excludes other people. And does that therefore challenge us to ask that question constantly? By doing this, who am I excluding, and what do I need to kind of keep in my mind in order to make sure that we include as many people as possible, or we do different things to include a wider variety of people?
Yeah,
I wonder if I could follow up on that and just ask. So you said earlier that Paul did virtual church, in that he did the letter writing that was sent to all the different communities, and I just wonder about the challenges therefore of that within things like discipleship. One of the challenges we have as church is, how do we even maintain the contacts of people that may well be on the fringe, but also those people that aren't able to access technology. And so, yeah, I absolutely appreciate the letter writing. So what were the challenges for Paul in that, and what can we learn from that?
Well, you'll gather, and once you hear my talk, you'll know that my expertise is in 2 Corinthians, and therefore I go on and on about Corinthians the whole time. And I think 1 and 2 Corinthians shows you all of the challenges of that. Is that the problem with sending out communication when people aren't in the same place as you is they get the wrong end of the stick. And basically, I think 1 and 2 Corinthians are the worked example of how you send out a letter and people go, what? And basically, that's my short summary of 1 and 2 Corinthians, but effectively, I think that's what's going on, is that you've got that kind of gap between what you're trying to say and what people hear. And which is not to say it doesn't happen in person, but it just kind of happens in a different way in person. So I think that real challenge is of people understanding how relationships work and how that kind of discipleship communication goes on. I mean, the thing I love at the start of 2 Corinthians is that Paul is talking about the breakdown of relationship between him and the Corinthian church. And the reason they're really cross with him is because he didn't visit when he said he would. And I would say that is at the heart of nearly all conflict in church life, is people not being visited when they think they ought to have been. It was ever thus.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we'll move on if that's okay. Paula, in your talk, because I have heard it, I was listening to it this morning before I joined this meeting. But in your talk, you do talk about hope for the future, and I guess it would be interesting to hear from you. You know, what signs of hope for the future do you see, and perhaps what might shape that, or what might undermine that hope for us as we look to the future?
Well, those of you who are listening now will have heard the talk, so you'll know what I said. But basically, for me, the vision of hope is that the world is not how you think it is, that the world is transformed by the death and resurrection of Jesus. So there is, in Hebrews, my absolute favorite saying about hope is hope, that sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. That, you know, no matter what's going on, no matter how miserable you are, no how despairing you are, there is hope that is sitting strong and firm. In fact, an example I often use comes from the deaf community. And when the deaf community in the southern dialect sign hope, they do it like that. So they have 2 words for hope. They have 1 word for hope, which is, you know, if you say, I hope I'll see you tomorrow, they do this. And if they talk about Christian hope, they do that. And I absolutely love that as a communication of what we're about as Christians, is we're about this sure and steadfast hope that keeps us going beyond everything else. So that's what gives me hope, is that beyond my anxieties and beyond what I think is going on, and beyond my kind of worst case scenarios, which I'm really good at, there is this, the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. And that is what gives me hope. But I'll tell you what else gives me hope. Christians. Christians who are in leadership, Christians who are worshipping God in everything that they do. They also drive me to distraction, it must be said. I mean, church life is intensely infuriating. But actually, the way in which Christians across the country have simply knuckled down to show God's love in their communities is the biggest thing that gives me hope. You know, instead of just sitting at home with the door shut going, it's all awful, we can't do anything. Actually seeing what Christians have done across the country in terms of caring for people, that there is hope. And I think that's what gives me the greatest hope.
Claude, Elaine? How would you respond?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, that's quite encouraging to hear, Paula. And I also think that we can look at the practical expression of God's love and the sharing of hope amongst the Christian community all over the world. And I think that even before the pandemic, churches and the Christian community globally were doing things, and they were responding to the needs of people around the world, but it wasn't very much known, and people had not become aware. But I think out of a situation of hopelessness where we all know that people are dying, old people are locked indoors and can come out, people have all forms of anxiety, and that general feeling of desperation and hopelessness that is being felt all around the world is now being responded to collectively by the Christian church. And I think there is something about Paul calling the church to be a community that responds to the needs of people. And I don't know if you'd like to say something about that, because now I think there's more of a unified approach towards responding to the needs of people, which I think brings a lot of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you, Claude. But I think for me, one of the really striking things about Paul's letters is that by and large, most of the letters start with a piece of theology, depending on how long they are. You have a kind of piece of theology, and Paul then goes, so now what are you going to do? How are you going to live that out in your lives? Kind of the end bits of the letters are all about, so this is what you do now. And I think you're absolutely spot on, Claude, is that actually what we are being forced into in a really good way is that this is how we live it out in our lives. And you see it all over the place. And it's really, really encouraging.
I think for me, one of the kind of words I've been really dwelling in this time is opportunity. And I think that really resonates with that hope that you have as well. And just how much God is using this opportunity of just breaking things down, of building things new, of just doing things differently. And for me, that is about hope, because that is looking at the situation and going, actually, I'm not going to despair, because I have hope that is certain in God, and God has given us this great opportunity. You know, we see how people are reaching out differently into their communities and setting up WhatsApps with their neighbours and just brilliant things like that of being opportunistic in this this place. And I think as I kind of think about Paul, actually he had almost nothing but opportunity. You know, the church was so new and so fresh. He was building onto something new, and to some extent we have something of that opportunity. You know, things have been broken down that have been built up, and so I just wonder what hope there is of how we might copy Paul in that, what the foundations, the blueprints are that we can look to in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so interesting, isn't it? Is that I think one of our greatest privileges and one of our greatest curses in the 21st century is how Christianity has been kind of a steadfast thing at the heart of society. And now one of our greatest kind of challenges is the fact that actually it's no longer there. We can't assume that we'll have any privileges or any kind of and I think it kind of takes us back to that early church situation of, you know, we've got some good news to tell you. you know, we've really got some great news to tell you. Let's tell you. So I think one of the things I've been really struck by is that for many years, people have gone, yeah, we know about your good news. You know, we're bored with your good news. Whereas actually for the first time, we've got people that we can say, look, let's tell you this for the first time. And it's amazing. And that is so exciting, I think.
Definitely.
Cool. Excellent. Go on, Claude.
Sorry, I'd like to chip in. Can I go on? Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 13, talking about love in particular, and then highlighting the three virtues of faith, hope, and love. We're living in times where this, the expression of our faith, the giving of hope to the world, the expression of love to the world has become quite real. And Paula, I don't know if you'd like to say something about that, how we can actually live out these three virtues in the times that we're in.
Oh, yes. Great question. Well, we've talked about hope, haven't we? So let's not do hope again, because we've done that already, but think about faith and love. And start with faith, because faith is such an important word in Paul, as everybody knows. It's kind of real nugget right at the heart of his theology. And I think what's going on when Paul is talking about faith is a lot of faithfulness. There is the facts of what we believe, which is important, but there is that kind of importance of the faithfulness, the endurance, the keeping going. You find it, you mentioned Philippians earlier, and Philippians is really where Paul kind of explores that theme of endurance and faithfulness. So I think living out in the world, those three things, faith, hope, and love, you have the faithfulness of our faith in Christ, the endurance, the carrying on through everything that we do and everything that we have. You've got the hope that we've spoken about already. And as Paul says so rightly, the greatest of these is love, that it is the love of God for us, which we show through our actions and the way in which we live our lives, which draw the faith and the hope together. So, and I think there's something just really beautiful about Paul's vision of faith, faithfulness, hope, and love, which kind of pulls his theology together.
Paula, that's really good, really helpful. I've got one more question I think I'd like to explore with all of us. This is a ministers' conference, and so, you know, church is really important for us, I guess, in that sense, and that kind of physical gathering. But what do you think that you know, because we can't gather together physically at the moment, what can we kind of learn, and what do you think about that? Because that's not happening for us at all at the moment, and certainly when we perhaps go into whatever tier we might be into, it's going to be happening again in very different ways. We've not gathered in the way that was normal for a very long time now.
I think this is really, really important. And I, a few years ago, wrote a book about Paul's understanding of the body, which is something that I'm absolutely passionate about, because I think it's something that we have underestimated in the church. That embodiment is really significant. And one of the things you find in 1 and 2 Corinthians again, is Paul's theology of the body coming through really clearly, that actually what we do with our bodies individually and corporately, the body of Christ, is crucially important. I just feel it's rather ironic that I wrote this book in 2016, and now I'd write a really different book, because we've suddenly been thrown kind of the curveball is, okay, you think bodies are important, if you do, and I do. So what do you do when you can't actually gather together physically? What then? What does the body of Christ look like when you can't bring your bodies together in church together? It's a real interesting challenge, I think. A couple of reflections. One of them is that actually what lockdown has done for me is reinforced how important I think my body is in my worship, as in physically gathering together with people, is a fundamental part of my understanding of what church is. And I would say that even more clearly now. I haven't been able to go to church physically for a long time. That there is something actually about the physicality of turning up and being together with people, which is really important. And what I'm about to say about how that can be mitigated at the moment doesn't undermine the fact that I think that's really important. And the minute I can go back and worship physically again with the other people in the body of Christ, I'll be there knocking on the door going, me, let me in. But having said that, the really interesting thing is that we've been forced to gather together as churches non-physically, and what things we learned from that. I think the thing I'm absolutely fascinated about in Paul's writings is that Paul had to do that right from the start. The word ecclesia, as you will probably know, means simply gathering together. It was referred, it started being used in Greek society to refer to the people who gathered together to vote in a city. And it's really interesting that Paul chose that word, the early church chose that word to describe what it meant to gather together as a community, as the body of Christ. So it meant physically gathering together. But very, very quickly, Paul went from using that word to describe physically gathering together to describe all those who were gathered together spiritually in being the body of Christ. So he can talk to people about being church who've never actually been in the same place together. So therefore, he very quickly moved from being the importance of physical gathering to the importance of spiritual gathering. And I think for me, one of the things that we've learned in lockdown, and one of the things that is for me really important about church at the moment, is the recognition that gathering can take place beyond bodies as well as with bodies, and that our spiritual gathering is really very significant. So for me, the question about online worship is, to what extent is it ecclesia, a gathering? Because one of the things that I really dislike about online worship is that I can get really passive. You know, I can turn up in my pajamas with my cup of coffee and something to eat and watch it. And then if I go, oh, it's not so good this week, I can go to someone else's and go to their, you know, you can kind of do voyeurism by worship these days, where you can kind of cherry pick the one you like the best. And it's not about gathering. There's no sense of gathering in it. So I think for me, the really interesting question is, while we have to worship non-physically online, what is the gathering bit? And how do we make sure that the gathering takes place in a way that actually makes it genuinely church and not just me kind of hopping from service to service, getting the best bits?
Yes, my parents tell me they do 6 churches on a Sunday now.
Yeah, that's right.
Beyond my understanding. Claude, you were going to chip in, I think, so please carry on.
Yes, I was going to say something about something that we reflected on quite recently, and it's quite interesting. It was just a kind of a pun, dismembering, or the dismembering of a church, which had happened in our context. Just to give you a bit of a background on one of my churches, IPC in particular, which initially started with young people, millennials, and over the time, we've had an experience of fluidity and a lot of people coming. And I would say that the life cycle of a church has always been around 3 years. People coming as students, university students, they move out and they're gone. And it was a bit of a concern to us as a leadership just before the pandemic, because we thought that we were not growing as a church and the church was being dismembered. People were coming and going, but we were reflecting on our online presence and how a lot of people have kind of remembered our church and have been able to join in. And so we're playing with these words of dismembering and remembering, and obviously the church actually has been able to bring together people who have actually moved away. And on a very positive note, we have had a lot of people who had been isolated being brought closer into the church community. And I don't know if we can have a theological view of that as well, from the perspective of Paul?
I mean, I love the playing with the words, the dismembering and the remembering is superb. Unfortunately, as is often the case with Paul's writings, the best puns in English don't translate into Greek, and the best puns in Greek don't translate into English, vice versa. So therefore, I don't think you can't quite do it in the same kind of way with Paul, but I love the idea.
Excellent.
I think for me, some of what you've spoken about kind of reflects my own journey throughout the pandemic of actually at the start embracing everything online and being very much, this is a very valid way of being church. Even though we're scattered, we are still gathered. To a point I'm at now where I'm basically like, I just want to meet with people and be together. I'm done with online, if I'm honest. But I think even the journey needs to continue into almost a mixed economy of both. You know, I'm addressing what it means to be the body of the church, the physical gathering. But I think what you raised there about the spiritual gathering and how we do that online, I think that's a challenge that isn't going to go away. Yeah. We still need to be exploring that. So just wondered if you had any input on that a little bit more.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I don't really, because I haven't. If I had an easy answer, I'd have written a book about it already. But I think there is. I think it's simply recognizing the importance of the resonance and actually what does spiritual gathering mean for us, and actually does spiritual gathering mean that we ought to be able to disagree with each other? Because I think there is something about disagreement that also brings a spiritual gathering, certainly once you've kind of done with shouting at each other, that kind of a spiritual gathering that happens afterwards is how do we kind of recognize the deep things of life? How do we share what is important to us in our lives and in our spiritual journeys? How do we take the time to listen to other people? They're the usual questions about church, but they're just exacerbated because we're all online. And I wonder whether actually what the gift that we have at the moment is to learn to ask the questions, and maybe the questions are the key thing rather than any answers I might try and make up for you in the next couple of minutes.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think if I'm honest, the thing I miss the most is singing with other people. Just sing. Hey, there we are. I'm sure one day we will. We missed you there, Claude. You didn't quite come through.
Okay. Yeah, I was just adding to what you were saying, that there is something about the gathering of a church that everybody seems to be missing, and it places value on the physical gathering of a church, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I completely agree. Paula, that's been really, really helpful. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Claude. I hope everybody else in the conference has enjoyed our conversation together. I do have one more question for you, Paula. After this section in the conference, we as a conference are going to move into a time of prayer. We're going to do that on Zoom, break down into smaller groups on Zoom. So I thought it would be really good for us to hear from you what we, London Baptists, can pray specifically for you at the moment. So maybe you could share that with us now.
Well, probably it's the same thing as for everybody else. So I hardly think that what I'm asking for is the thing that nobody else needs. But it's endurance, the ability to keep going. I'm conscious that I kind of, in lockdown 1, I went, oh, it's okay, we can do this and we can do this and this and this. And I ran around and did it all. And then in lockdown 2, I went, oh, we can do it again and it's fine. And in lockdown 3, I'm clean empty now. I'm done with all of my, so how that spirit of endurance that keeps us going through everything. If you could pray for that for me, that would be absolutely fabulous. I'm starting to do various other bits of writing work, so it's the endurance that leads into creativity. I could really do with some of that. So that would be lovely if you were able to pray for that for me.
Absolutely.
And in fact, for everybody else who needs it as well. It feels very selfish just to ask for it for me.
No. I was asking
for it for everyone.
I was asking specifically for your prayer request. We'll all get the opportunity to pray for each other at the conference. So this bit was absolutely fine for it just to be about you. That's perfectly fine. Elaine, thank you. Claude, thank you for being with us today. And Paula, thank you for this conversation and the teaching that you brought to us earlier in the day as well. Really great to be with you, for you to be with us. And we're so appreciative of your time with us today, but in the prep for that over the past few days as well. So thank you. Thanks, guys. Cheers.